Please be seated. Excuse me. All right. You know, I don't think you can do justice to that text with many readings of it. But folks, Jesus is on one today in Mark chapter 12. We are returning to the Gospel of Mark in our worship schedule after a little bit of a break. So some context for today's passage is in order. So first, remember that for a couple of months, late August, September, and into October, we were going through chapters 8 through 11 of Mark, where Jesus and his disciples were coming from north in Galilee, and they were journeying to Jerusalem. And eventually when they would get there, that would be Jesus' last week, Palm Sunday, Holy Week, when he arrives. And so here are some highlights on that journey that we covered over the last couple months. In chapter 8, Jesus taught the disciples that following him means picking up a cross. It means action and sacrifice. And then in chapter 9, the disciples on the road were arguing with one another about who was the greatest disciple. And then Jesus told them, just serve the helpless. And then in chapter 10, Jesus taught on divorce. And he gave a really complicated approach. But one thing he stressed clearly is the utter importance of taking care of the vulnerable. And then in chapter 10, Jesus publicly blessed little poor orphaned children. And he implored people to value and cherish them and care for them. And then, right after that, he said in no uncertain terms, he said to the rich man that those with wealth must live generously. And then in chapter 11, he and his crew finally come down into Jerusalem. And Jesus very publicly went into the temple and he flipped over tables in a rage due to people and power's greed and exploitation that had hijacked religion and religious spaces, all at the expense of the poor. So one consistent theme of Jesus, this last many chapters, seems to be that if you're going to be a follower of him, and if we're going to live into the vision of the prophets of old, then he wants compassionate, meaningful generosity towards others, especially the abused and the suffering. And now here we are in chapter 12. He has just days to live. And things are heating up between Jesus and people in religious power. He's been going back and forth with them for days since Palm Sunday. And in our passage, we witness Jesus go at them again. And here, he critiques the temple scribes, uptight religious people. And he says this, beware. Beware, folks, because they like to walk around in long robes. They like to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. They like to have the best seats in the synagogues and the banquet halls. And yet, they devour widows' houses. Friends, Jesus isn't warm and cuddly here. Neither is he professorial or educational in tone. He is irate. He is fresh off of heated debates with people in power. And he is fresh off of flipping tables over in a public protest. It would likely be proper to imagine him saying these words in Mark 12 in full infuriation. He appears incredibly agitated by phony religious people. By people who keep up all the appearances of being devout and faithful, and yet do so as they neglect and trample the poor. After this spicy critique, what happens next is really interesting. The text continues. Jesus sat down and he watched. He watched the crowd putting money into the treasury, the offering plate. And a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins. And then Jesus had to call the disciples. And he said to them, "Look, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing, because she out of her poverty has put in everything." It's a perfectly poetic scene. The phony, proud, and oppressive ways of corrupt religious folks are called out. And then their shame is compounded as one of these poor people in their midst that they have neglected extends her remarkable generosity, further exposing their faith as cheap. She does it without fanfare or desire for glory, but out of faith, one biblical scholar emphasizes. In other words, she does it because she believes not only in her own comfort or security, but rather she believes in the whole health of the whole community. This widow is an example of everything Jesus has been trying to teach the disciples of what following him looks like. It looks like humble and bold compassion. Her poverty is an indictment of those who oppress her, and her generosity is an example and inspiration of true discipleship. And now I want to circle back to Jesus' earlier critique before this widow's generosity. I want to circle back to his seething review of religious people who talk the talk but don't walk the walk. We might not want to hear it, but I think Jesus is profoundly clear here. Jesus doesn't like religion that proudly and loudly worships him, but hurts and forgets the battered and neglected people on the margins. We can say we are Christian. We can go through all the motions of worshiping and branding ourselves as followers and lovers of Jesus. But this text stands to reveal that Jesus finds it despicable if we simultaneously neglect caring for others. He has no time for such half-hearted, hypocritical faith. We can dress in all the robes, in other words. We can put up all the flowers. We can sing all the songs, and we can sit at the seats of power and status. We can put on all the displays of religiosity, and we can read the Bible, and we can make all the public professions, and we can tell all people how much we love Jesus. And all of it is an empty charade if it is not producing genuine compassion and protection and love for others, especially the vulnerable. There is no escaping that seething review from Jesus if we are to take chapters like this in Mark seriously. To do otherwise is what Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who gave his life trying to protect the vulnerable in Nazi Germany, to do otherwise is what Dietrich Bonhoeffer calls cheap grace. It is Christian fanfare without loving action, bold loving action in the world. Or as Bonhoeffer put it directly, it is grace without discipleship. And he adds, Christianity without discipleship is always Christianity without Christ. It's fake. It's pretending. To put it clearly and harshly again, based on this passage and passages like it, if we are not fighting for and protecting the suffering, the poor, the bullied, and the abused, then we are betraying Jesus' vision for the world at such a fundamental level, it seems pathetic to point it out. And if you think I'm being dramatic, look again at the end of verse 40. Jesus is being dramatic. The end of verse 40 is about as close as he can possibly come from saying that such religious hypocrisy of loving God but forgetting the poor and oppressed deserves a special place in hell. As he says, deserves the greater condemnation. If this all indicts you and makes you feel uncomfortable, know that it indicts me too. I feel ashamed of where I have fallen short of serving and protecting those on the margins. I feel ashamed of where the whole Christian church has fallen short. Sometimes it is softly and tenderly Jesus is calling. And sometimes we get passages like this, where he harshly calls us to task, especially if we are going to represent him in the world. Jesus is beckoning us to a more compassionate and generous life and to stop the charades of hypocrisy and apathy. The good news is that we have the fuel to heed this beckoning. And that fuel comes from Jesus himself, who is willing to forgive us for failing the poor and the bullied around us. He will forgive us every time. He went to the cross to prove it. And simultaneously, he every time will fiercely demand that we rise back up, we dust ourselves off, and we lean into a costly life of discipleship where we fight for all our neighbors who are suffering and need protection. So perhaps, because Jesus gives us his whole life, perhaps we, like that widow, can give our lives to the betterment of one another, to speak for the voiceless, to feed the hungry, to protect the vulnerable and stand up for the bullied and love the unloved. Because short of that, through his word, Jesus will call us out on our hypocrisy every time. Amen.